Folks, there are some seats over here. The second, third, and fourth row. For those of you in the rear of the chapel, if you'd like to take a seat, there's some available seats over here. We're about to begin the services for Dr. Robert J Minkus. I'd like to welcome all of you here, as well as everyone who is logged online. The services will be conducted by Rabbi Ari Hart from Skokie Valley, Agudath in Skokie. I'll ask everyone to please rise as the family enters the chapel.
Please be seated. We're gathered together this morning to say a difficult goodbye to a beloved husband, father, brother, grandfather, father-in-law, healer, mentor, leader, and friend to so many. Dr. Robert Minkus, Ruvain ben Moshe ben Miriam. On Chol HaMoed, Sukkot, a joyous time, we don't offer formal hespedim, but instead we share words of inspiration and love and Torah-framed tributes to the life of Dr. Minkus. So this morning, after a chapter of Tehillim, we'll hear words of love from his children and from him, from Michael and Hannah and Becca, followed by reflections from his sons and daughters-in-law, Lara, David, and Joe. And then Matan will speak on behalf of the grandchildren, followed by a closing Torah reflection. We'll begin with Psalm 23, a psalm about courage and faith, something Bob embodied so beautifully. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai Robi Lo Echsar, Bino Desha Yarbitzeni, Ame Menuchot Yinahaleni, Nafshi Yeshovev Yancheni B'Maglit Tzedek Laman Shemo, Gam Ki Elech B'Geit Tzalmavet Lo Yirara Ki Ata Imadi, Shivtecha Mishantecha Hema Yenachamoni, Taroch Lefanai Shulchan Neged Zorerai Dishanta B'Shem Roshi Kosi Revaya, Ach Tov V'Chesed Yudefuni Kol Yemei Chayai, V'shavti b'veit Adonai la'orech yamim. A song of David, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God causes me to lie down in lush pastures. God leads me beside tranquil waters. God restores my soul and guides me in righteous paths for God's name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your scepter and staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in full view of my adversaries. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. May only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for the length of days. Michael.
couple of weeks ago, my dad made us aware that he had written a eulogy for himself, which he made us promise to share at his funeral. Here it is. When I was alive, which was not that long ago, I was often accused of being the sort of guy who always wanted to control everything. I totally rejected that characterization, and so, to make sure the record was set straight, I decided to write my own eulogy. Here goes. I had a wonderful life. I was conceived about a week after VE Day when the Nazis were defeated in Europe. A baby boomer born into a time of great optimism and hope for the future. It really was like Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, and yes, even Leave It to Beaver. I grew up in Peterson Park, an idyllic 1950s Chicago neighborhood. Peterson Park was settled right after the war by returning veterans, all starting families. Every house had kids my same age. We walked to school and walked home for lunch. We watched cartoons on TV with our tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwich. No organized activities, just rode our bikes to the park for a pickup ball game. Forget about organized activities, we organized ourselves. The neighborhood was so new it did not even have a real school. We went to a 2-room prefab we called the Portables, located in an undeveloped, still forested corner of the neighborhood. Recess was in the woods. The happiest day of my young life was October 22nd, 1952, when my brother Paul was born. By that time, I was 6 years old, and most of my friends had siblings. I wanted one of those too. My father got me boxes of candy, Butterfingers and Baby Ruths, to hand out in school to celebrate. 5 years later, my brother Jonathan was born, another great day. Another big day was when Crane's Pharmacy opened. They had a raffle, and I won an English racing bike. Unfortunately, it was taller than me, and we had to get rid of it. Life changed a lot the next year, 1958, when my parents decided they wanted a summer home in some resort area in southern Wisconsin called Nippersink. Thus began a series of beautiful summers in Nippersink that continues today. In 1960, I started at Von Steuben High School. I had a successful high school career. In the fall of 1963, I matriculated, and he wrote in parentheses, I like that word. I matriculated at Cornell University. At first, I was quite happy, but grew steadily less so, and transferred the next spring to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Most of it was missing my girlfriend, a beautiful blonde named Carol Stryker, who actually had been my girlfriend since 6th grade, believe it or not. I was an English literature major and fortunate to be accepted to the honors English program, so I had a very stimulating educational experience. I am not being modest in saying that I was the dumbest one in the program, which made it heady and challenging. Hedging my bets, I also took all the required pre-med prerequisites. I should mention that I was also a fraternity member, which was both a terrible experience and the most fun I ever had. Leave it at that. After college, I matriculated, and he wrote, there it is again, at Northwestern University Medical School, which was the usual med school grind. My first year, I roomed in a sort of tenement with my dear friend Eli Michaels, who was a year ahead of me at Northwestern. On June 30th, 1968, Carol and I married, so she became my new roommate. Michael was born in 1972, Rebecca 1975, and Hannah 1981. After med school, I did a pediatric residency at Children's Memorial Hospital, followed by a year as the first chief pediatrics resident at Lutheran General Hospital. As it was during the Vietnam War, I joined the U.S. Army Reserve for 6 years, reaching the rank of major. After Lutheran, we then moved to Madison, Wisconsin, so I could do a 1-year fellowship in child development. Our time there was divine, one of the happiest times of our life together. I would be remiss if I did not mention Dr. Bob Mendelson, my med school mentor, who completely shaped how I had thought and practiced medically, a true once-in-a-lifetime inspiration. I had run out of training programs and had to get a real job, especially since we were now parents. I accepted a position at North Suburban Clinic, a multi-specialty group in Skokie. Basically, I have been there ever since, just different names on the paycheck. Now it is North Shore. I loved being a pediatrician. At some point in med school, I was told never to get emotionally involved or attached to patients or their families. Advice I decided to completely ignore. I thought that was where the payoff was. Indeed, I came to love so many patients, and they gave me love back. What could be better than that? In my early 60s, I decided to follow Carol's lead, and I applied for the master's program at Northwestern. It was a very heady experience. Being back on a college campus was unreal and so exciting. I ended up researching and writing a thesis I really liked, which analyzed the response to cholera outbreaks on the antebellum South slave population. Amazingly, I won the award that year for the best master's thesis at Northwestern. After that, I decided I would learn to play the cello, an instrument whose sound I love. I took lessons for 2 years. I would not say I ever played real well, but I did learn to play. Everyone ought to leave a legacy, some proof that they walked this earth. Mine and Carol's is our family. Our kids all grew up to be kind, ethical, responsible, and accomplished adults, and I am so proud and pleased that our grandchildren are already becoming such great people. But my biggest, most significant accomplishment, Carol and I became observant Jews. We had both grown up in loosely affiliated Reformed Jewish homes, and we were well aware that Jewishly we knew and did less than our parents, who knew and did less than theirs, a trend that likely began when our great-grandparents left Europe. This would not change unless we made it change. We decided to attempt to reverse this process of Jewish decay and lead Jewish lives. It seems to have worked. Our kids are all knowledgeable and observant to some degree, and now their kids are all getting Jewish school and camp experience and hopefully taking a Jewish life for granted. I am proud that we could provide a Jewish role model to my brother Jonathan's family, and I even have a nephew who's a rabbi. I would say I've had an accomplished life. This was my greatest accomplishment. Carol's too, of course. And he put a little quote here that says, "Remember, no man is a failure who has friends. I had a wonderful life."
Okay. When Joe and I moved into our house in Skokie, my dad came over to help me hang up some framed prints. He always loved that job because it was so precise and exact. When we finally got them up, the spacing wasn't exactly right, and he wanted to redo the whole wall. I, never one to have much attention to detail, said, "Dad, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." He looked at me and then said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." My dad did everything well, everything correctly. The textbook oldest child, he was high achieving, type A, a perfectionist, and never ever lacking in self-confidence. He had a sense always of how things ought to be, of the right way to do them, and his stance towards life was one of certainty and clarity, a perspective that is certainly alien to me, a deeply neurotic and anxious person. He was the great central fact of our lives. Well into adulthood, maybe embarrassingly late into adulthood, my siblings and I went to my dad for answers. He was our most trusted and revered oracle. Should I drop out of grad school or finish? Which school should our kids go to? Should we take the job? Should we move or should we stay? Should we buy this house or that one? He was our source of wisdom and of advice, always, and we basically always did what he said. He wasn't one for doubt or for shades of gray, and I think it wasn't until I was a mother 1 or 2 times over that I really accepted the possibility that my father might not be right about everything. One of the many things that my dad did meticulously was planning trips. Detailed trip itineraries were typed up in military hours. They included not only all the day's carefully planned activities, hour by hour, but also where every single meal would be eaten, including all the contact information for those restaurants, and specific things that were recommended to order, according to his exhaustive research. Every day was jam-packed. When he planned a trip to Israel for Joe and me, a family friend there looked at the itinerary and said that we couldn't realistically do everything he had planned, even if we had a private helicopter. Sometimes, if he was feeling generous, he would budget in a few hours on a weekend afternoon that would say, "at leisure," which meant that during that allotted time, you could read a book and take a nap in the hotel room. And after a trip was over and we were back home, he loved talking about how every last detail that he had planned worked out just perfectly, how everything was timed just right, how everything that he chose was just the right thing. When I was 8, we took a family trip to England. Months ahead of that trip, we went together to the Skokie Public Library, and he took out stacks of children's books about British history. At bedtime, he would read to me about the Magna Carta and the Anglos and the Saxons and the Battle of Hastings and the Tower of London, to be sure that I understood what we would be seeing, have context for all of it, and that every possible ounce of education and enrichment were squeezed out of that experience. I remember nothing about British history, but I do remember the feeling of lying in my childhood bed next to my dad with those musty old illustrated library books, and him reading them aloud to me. Incidentally, in another classic anecdote about my dad, my clearest memory of that trip is of standing outside in the pouring rain in some field somewhere in the English countryside, looking at some objectively very unimpressive Roman ruins, and everyone complaining and yelling at him that this was literally the worst. And he said, "You're complaining, but now you will always remember that the Romans were in Britain." And Dad, we do remember. My parents continued to take all kinds of far-flung and involved trips until relatively recently, to India and Cambodia and Peru and all over Europe. My dad's favorite planning website was TripAdvisor, to which he was an enthusiastic devotee. He had a very active profile on it and was, in keeping with his character, extremely diligent and serious about providing in-depth feedback on every hotel, restaurant, tour, and museum that they went to. He owed it to the TripAdvisor community. If other TripAdvisor members found your reviews useful, they could give you virtual thumbs up and helpful votes, thereby increasing your ranking and prestige within the online community. As he climbed the virtual ranks, he would get automated emails from the website telling him that now he was the 5th most popular reviewer on the North Shore of Chicago, and then a few months later, the 10th most popular in all of Chicago, and so on as he went up and up. He always forwarded us all these emails. In total seriousness, so proud of all of his reviews and all the thumbs up that he was getting, and that his status on TripAdvisor was always increasing. This is maybe my favorite anecdote about my dad ever. It combines his obsessive thoroughness with how pleased he usually was with himself in a way that I find totally delightful. My dad loved being a doctor more than any other doctor I know. He was a pediatrician, an outstanding one, with a deeply devoted group of patients, many of whom went to him as children and then grew up and sent their own children to him. So many times in my life, people heard my last name and then asked if I was related to Dr. Minkus. When I said that that was my father, a torrent of love always followed. He was the most wonderful doctor, the sweetest man. He had helped their family so much. That they adored him. Being a physician was central to my father's identity and sense of purpose. He kept working through chemotherapy, through radiation, through tremors, through intense weakness and nausea and fatigue, all during COVID, because his patients needed him. And he believed that the work he was doing was sacred. We begged him again and again and again to stop working, that it was too hard for him, too much. And he resisted and refused until it was literally physically impossible for him to walk. He loved his work, and his patients loved him. We always knew he was appreciated, but the avalanche of deep grief and real love that we have felt from his patients over the past few days has been overwhelming in the most beautiful way imaginable. My father was somewhat of a rebel when it came to the medical establishment. Above all, what he really believed in were mothers and babies, in the sacredness of that bond, in a mother's intuition, and that a mother was the expert on her own children. An ally to crunchy, countercultural parents everywhere, he was a proponent of home births and co-sleeping and breastfeeding for like 5 years, none of which I personally had any interest in. He had very vocal opinions about each of my pregnancies and births. When I told him that I was pregnant with Sadie, the first thing he said to me, literally, was that I had to deliver at Evanston and that he wanted me to go to a specific group of midwives. And of course, I did deliver at Evanston, and I did use the midwives that he wanted me to. He was there when Sadie was born. He gave the okay when they had to call in an OB to do an emergency procedure to get her out, and he immediately examined my newborn baby. Judah was born in Brooklyn, frustratingly out of his reach, but he researched and okayed the midwife group that I chose in Park Slope, as well as the hospital that Judah was born at. When I sent him pictures of Judah after he was born, he texted me right back and said that the name bracelets on his ankles were too tight and I should make the nurses redo them immediately. He also reminded me that a hospital is not a prison and I should just check myself out and go home whenever I wanted. He loved people leaving hospitals against medical orders. When I was induced with Eli 2 weeks overdue, he showed up unannounced with a stethoscope around his neck like 5 hours before Eli was finally born, waiting patiently for him to arrive and to examine his grandson. Of course, the labor and delivery nurse that I had that day turned out to be his patient, and between contractions told me how much she loved Dr. Minkus and how much he had mattered to her family. He was our doctor for all medical things. It was my dad who drove me to the hospital when my gallbladder exploded at 2 a.m. and pulled rank to get me to the front of the line in the ER. It was my dad who sat up with me in the middle of the night, listening to Judah's breathing when he had the croup and was gasping for air, and coached me through it. It was my dad who came with me again to the ER when Eli split his head open and needed stitches, and he bossed the poor doctor around about how to do them and made sure we were taken care of. And at the end, when my dad was a patient in Evanston Hospital, on the whiteboard in the room, there was a spot for an interesting fact about the patient, and he had told the nurse to write, "I am Dr. Minkus, and I work in this hospital." At the very end, when he had gotten mentally foggy and we were trying to think of things to talk to him about, we asked him medical questions that we knew were real lightning rods for him. "Dad, do you think the exact number of a kid's temperature matters when they have a fever?" And his eyes would get very wide, and he'd say, "Definitely not. I can tell you that for sure." "Dad, do you like cough syrup?" "Cough syrup's total garbage." He hated cough syrup. A doctor until the end. Of course, the thing that he did best of all was being our father. He was tremendous. He just cared so much. No matter how busy he was at work, and he worked a lot, he always made it a priority to do things with each of us alone. From dinners at dive Indian restaurants on Devon Avenue to individual ski trips, he made sure to have experiences alone with each of his children, and he proactively made that happen. I have such clear memories of standing in front of the dioramas at the Chicago History Museum on Sunday afternoons with him, and him explaining every detail of the Chicago Fire and the Chicago World's Fair to me. He took me alone on a beautiful trip to Ireland. He is the one who took each of us on our trips to visit colleges. When I was interested in backpacking, he took me camping alone in southern Utah to see all the national parks in the state. When I spent summers in Missoula, Montana during college, he came out and hiked around Yellowstone and Glacier with me. He thought that the Salmon Schechter 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. wasn't educationally adequate, so he just planned his own trip. He rented an RV and took us on a 2-week tour of historical sites on the East Coast, Jamestown and Gettysburg and Colonial Williamsburg, and on and on. He was not always an easy parent. He was demanding, but it always came from a place of total love and investment, and we absolutely understood that. Every birthday card he ever gave us included constructive criticism, things he thought we should work on, areas for improvement, if you will. He thought that they didn't teach writing well enough in school, so he would make us write book reports for him in the summer at Nippersink, which he then corrected and then made us revise again and again until he was satisfied. They definitely didn't teach geography well enough, so he had big maps laminated and hung them in the basement and did map study with us with a pointer. He taught me to ride a bike by taking me out onto a flat part of the golf course at Nippersink, and he told me that we weren't going back into the house until I could do it. I remember it getting dark and crying and falling and kicking that bike and saying, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. And he just kept saying, you get back on the bike. We're staying out here until you ride the bike. And wouldn't you know it, through tears and in the dark, I learned to ride the bike that night. He was a spectacular father. He often told us that the thing he was proudest of in his life was that all of his children led Jewish lives and had grandchildren who were affiliated and identified. He grew up in a deeply assimilated home, as was so common in the 50s in this country. The fact that he had grandchildren at Schechter and Ramah and that we all have Jewish homes was endlessly gratifying to him. He felt that he and my mom had successfully reversed the trend of assimilation that they grew up with. When he was in hospice, he was extremely preoccupied with when exactly Yom Kippur was. He didn't want to miss it, and he kept asking me if Joe had put up our sukkah yet. For my dad, there was almost no gap between how he thought one ought to live and how he actually lived. He did the next right thing with complete honesty and integrity, one thing at a time, again and again and again. He was frugal and hated waste, and he believed in spending money only on experiences, not on things. He had the same winter boots and parka my entire life, and that is not an exaggeration. And I think the boots were maybe issued by the Army. He thought you shouldn't hold grudges and should forgive people, so he just did. He thought you shouldn't waste time being in bad moods, and he was never aggravated for more than a few minutes at a time. He really held on to nothing, and he moved through his life with great emotional ease and lightness. He had mastered his internal life. He had almost total equanimity. He was not upset by the idea of dying. He was very accepting and philosophical about it. No one gets out of here alive, he'd shrug. Even at the very end, when we asked him how he felt, he always said, I feel good. And when we asked him if he needed a sedative, he always said that he definitely didn't want one, but that we should give one to my mom. My dad loved dark chocolate and gin martinis with blue cheese olives. He loved golfing with his brothers and his childhood friends from Nippersink. He loved crossword puzzles and logic puzzles. He loved the restaurant The Daily Catch on the north end of Boston and the whole north shore of Kauai, which was a spiritual mecca for him. He loved sunset cruises with gin and tonics with lots of lime on the boat in Nippersink. Somewhat inexplicably, he loved World War I Liberty Loan posters, which, much to my mom's chagrin, cover all the walls of their house. He loved Costco. He loved the Chicago Lyric Opera. He loved watching Bears games and screaming, "You bums," at the players, which my boys always thought was hilarious. He loved the New York Times, and he was engaged right up until the end in a deeply epic, years-long battle with the mailman at Nippersink, who somehow could never figure out how to consistently deliver the Sunday Times up there, despite dozens and dozens of phone calls from my dad every summer. Truly, it was his white whale. He loved the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Every Christmas, Beck and I would go with him to the Music Box Theater to one of the showings there. Literally, as soon as we sat down in the seats, and this is not an exaggeration, he would start sobbing, overcome by the earnestness of the whole scene, of all the Chicagoans in Santa hats and flashing jingle bell necklaces singing I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas along with the organ during the pre-show sing-along. By the end, when George Bailey is saved by the generosity of his friends and Clarence the Angel gets his wings, my dad's sobs and choking gasps and nose blowing were so intense that all we could do was shake our heads and pretend that we didn't know him. It was the best. The last year of my dad's life was very difficult. But up until then, I think it was objectively pretty terrific. He had a lifelong partner in my mom, who he'd been with since they were 12. They were married for 53 years. He told us he fell in love with her at the bar mitzvah party of some kid named Murphy, where she leaned over and he looked down the front of her dress. He had 3 children who worshiped and adored him. He danced at all of our weddings. And he loved David, Laura, and Joe like they were his own children. All of our spouses loved him too and were enormously devoted to both of my parents. He saw all 8 of his healthy grandchildren be born and had close relationships with all of them. We all lived within a few miles of each other. He had a job that he found profoundly meaningful and rewarding and that made other people's lives better. He had financial security. He had devoted lifelong friends from all stages of his life. And mixed into all of that was so much joy, so many luminous, shimmering memories of bonfires at Nippersink, of playing in the waves at sunset at Hanalei Beach, of crowded and loud Shabbat dinners. He had a blessed life, and I know that he felt that way too. All of that gives me comfort. And at the very end, when all hell broke loose, I am so proud that we did as he taught us to do. The 5 of us, along with our tremendous partners, stood unflinchingly in the eye of this most terrible storm, together with my parents, and we held each other. And we couldn't fix it, but by God, we all showed up for our family. Literally, day and night. And no one walked through this alone. We were there for all the good, and when things came crashing down, we were all there together for the bad too. And we knew how to do that because he had showed us how. There is nothing in my life that I am as proud of as being Dr. Minkus's daughter. I adored him, and all I ever really wanted was for him to be proud of me. He was the giant in my life, my North Star. He was for all of us. Our patriarch, our pater familias. We are shattered. And also I know that it is a privilege and a blessing to feel this much grief for the loss of a parent, to leave a wound this enormous and incomprehensible. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Because of course our grief is in proportion to our love for him, and our grief is the final way that we get to love and honor him. I am lost, but more than anything, I am lucky. I had the best of the best. What a life. What a legacy. His memory already is for a blessing.
Hannah and I didn't compare notes, so you'll see we had the same father. There's a lot of overlap. My dad loved Sukkot. He designed his own sukkah years ago with the help of his carpenter friend Bob Clocker to fit the exact contours of my parents' patio. And he relished putting it up each year with various grandchildren, insisting on eating every meal inside of it. I think he loved the sensory physicality of the holiday, the concrete parts of its observance, and the way that it explicitly encouraged the hosting of guests. He always wanted to host lots and lots of guests in the sukkah. He always wanted to host guests at our house, period. I can see his broad smile now, sitting in the sukkah. But Sukkot was only eclipsed for him by Yom Kippur, my dad's most favorite Jewish holiday, not something many people would claim. He loved Yom Kippur. He loved the austerity, the high spirituality, the discipline, the marathon nature of it. He would insist on staying in shul all day long each Yom Kippur, and always reported that he experienced a spiritual high at the end, and he meant it fully. He was a very spiritual person. My dad was such a beautiful and unique combination of deep intellect and rationality on the one hand, and unbridled, full-throated emotion and feeling on the other. First, the intellectual part of him. He loved to study and learn, always reading and acquiring more knowledge about every historical period, every war, every world leader and thinker. He believed in learning, continual learning, all across one's life. And he lived that way. He was a man of the mind, incessantly doing crosswords and annoying logic puzzles and Sudoku. He decided to get a master's degree from Northwestern years into his medical career, just to keep challenging himself. He took up cello in his 60s, just because. And he was methodical with everything he did, as he learned from his own father and as he taught us and his grandchildren that anything worth doing is worth doing right, which he repeated all the time. Anyone who has traveled with my dad or has benefited from a trip planned by my dad, and he planned so many friends' trips just out of kindness, knows that he took trip planning very seriously. He researched and read up on every aspect of a location before mapping out the perfect itinerary with the very best spots, the best restaurants, the most memorable sites. And as Hannah said, he was a devoted trip advisor reviewer, one of the most prolific and loved. Oh, the travels he had with all of us, with his children and grandchildren, with my mom. He traveled the world energetically and enthusiastically, so eager to experience new cultures. He taught us to spend whatever money we had on education, experiences, and tzedakah, but never things. He was the most unmaterialistic of people. Fancy things could not have mattered less to him. To the end, he was still wearing his ratty winter coat and boots that he had for probably 40 years. He was a rational and practical person and always honest, just as Hannah said. He told you what he thought, even if you didn't really want to hear it. And whenever I needed guidance or advice, help on navigating a difficult experience or decision, I knew I would always be able to rely on him for sensical, honest, measured, thoughtful advice. Advice that was true and that would ultimately lead me where I needed to go. He was my most steady, trusted guide. And for 49 years, my dad was a pediatrician. It defined him, filled him up, gave him purpose and identity, and a doorway into some of the most lasting and rich relationships in his life. As Hannah said, he treated so many of his patients' children, second-generation patients. Such a testament to the deep love and care that he brought to doctoring. The relationships that he developed with his patients overflowed far beyond the office walls. Patients texted him, called him at home, came to the house when they needed support or guidance. He was an old-time physician who believed in the relationship piece of doctoring. Through his work, he impacted countless lives, both those of children and their parents. I've heard time and time again that he knew how, with tenderness and respect, to empower parents, to make them feel heard and validated, to honor them in the very hard work of parenting. He let them speak and share whatever they needed to share, whether it was about the child's health or their own well-being and struggles. It didn't matter. It was all valuable. My dad was often running late in the office because he always made the time and space to listen to each of his patients, and they knew that. They felt that presence and attunement keenly. This past week, as he was declining, he kept insisting on looking at his phone, and we would help him scroll through the many beautiful texts from his patients who were desperately reaching out to make sure he was okay, to share their love and concern. Since his passing, we have read so many tributes from these patients, people that I don't know who have messaged me, outpourings of love and gratitude and such sorrow at the loss. So many saying that he broke the mold, that he was one in a million, sharing what a profound loss his passing is to the patients, but also to the whole precious community of doctors, midwives, doulas, who came together to create a nourishing refuge for parents who were looking for a special kind of care. His medical practice was a practice of love. Convincing him to stop seeing patients, as Hannah said, as his health deteriorated, was one of the hardest things we have ever had to do. He was so insistent for weeks and weeks. He simply could not stop working because his patients needed him. It was devastating for him. But all of this pales in comparison to the other side of him, the part that was just my dad. My loving, affectionate, tender-hearted, gentle, very sentimental dad. People say that I look just like him. And he always loved to tease me about it, to bring up the fact that our faces look so much alike and how I must hate that. But he was wrong. I've never hated it. And especially now, it's an honor to carry his likeness. My dad had a poet's soul. He wore his heart on his sleeve, never shying away from hugging and kissing us, from emoting, from telling us how much he loved us and how proud he was of us again and again. Friends have reached out over the past weeks to let me know how much his loving embraces, his listening ear, his calm and sensitive presence meant to them. He was never afraid to show how he felt, to cry when tears welled up. As Hannah said, each year we had this winter tradition of going to see It's a Wonderful Life at the Music Box Theater. My dad loved traditions. And each year we would bring out the Kleenex because when we came toward the end of the movie, the last scene, he would break out in loud sobs every single time. He would always fall apart at that point because he said he felt like the richest man in town, and he was. He was the most devoted of husbands. He and my mom met when they were 12 years old in 6th grade and began a lifetime romance. 53 years of marriage, of building a life, a family together. 3 children, 3 children-in-law, 8 grandchildren. He loved my mom with total dedication. And until the very end, when my mom would come up to his bedside and hold his hand and ask him if he knew who she was, he would say, "My beautiful wife." My mom cared for my dad this past excruciating year. Weathering all of the horrible pain and stress that comes with being the primary caregiver for your ill husband of over 5 decades. I'm not sure how she endured it. My siblings and I learned what steady, loving devotion in marriage looks like from watching my mom and my dad. Together, they formed the bedrock of our family, its beating heart, and together they built the life from which we are privileged to draw blessings. My dad adored being a grandfather to his 8 grandchildren, shepherding so much nachas from their achievements. He cherished time with each of them. He was not a sideline grandparent. He showed up for everything, every game, either as a fan in the stands or as a coach. During his last year of illness, he was still showing up while undergoing chemo and radiation to all their games, as I watched nervously, afraid that he would be too weak to walk to the field or lose his balance while he was cheering. But when we would try to tell him it was okay, he could miss this one game, he would not hear it. He would be there, and he was. And he would call my kids after their games to offer detailed pointers for the next game. And Mira told me the other day that she still has voicemails from my dad saved in her phone of him calling after a game to tell her all she needed to do better next time in the basketball game. On one of his final days, when I was lying next to him, he looked at me and said, "Send me their schedules," because he didn't want to miss any of their games. He insisted on teaching Matan to drive because, as he said, he was the best driver in the family. And he even managed to get one driving lesson in with Meira before it just became impossible. He was truly the best of grandfathers, and his passing leaves a giant hole in our children's lives. My amazing dad was my friend, my guide, my role model, my safety net, my biggest champion and loudest supporter. He was my heart. There are so many memories, too many moments to share now, but that have been flooding back at me throughout the last days. Quiet moments of shared, intimate love with my dad. My dad had 2 favorite places in the world, Nippersink and Kauai. Both places which became beloved because they were our places, our family's places, for regular convening, for creating shared memories, for stepping outside of time to just be together. My heart, all of our hearts, are filled with so many holy moments in those sacred family spots. I think of sitting on the sand at K Beach on our beloved Kauai, passion fruit cocktail in hand, watching the sunset behind the Nepali coast, and of watching my dad's face of total awe and wonder, feeling his warm embrace as we took in something so beautiful together. And he would just say again and again, "So gorgeous, it never gets old." Or of going out with him at night each July 4th on our boat in Nippersink on Lake Benedict to watch the fireworks anchored in the middle of the lake. I'm so grateful that we were able to share one last 4th together this past summer out on the lake, watching the beautiful fireworks explode over our heads. Tomorrow will be my and David's 21st wedding anniversary. And I will always remember the look on my father's face on that day, radiating utter joy and loving pride. My dad loved his life. He loved his work. He loved his family, his wife, his children, all of our spouses, and his grandchildren. He loved his 2 brothers, Paul and Jonathan. He loved his friends, his old and beloved friends, so many still so close to him from his childhood. He loved my friends and Michael's friends and Hannah's friends, so many of whom who have reached out to share how loved they felt by him, how he embraced them like they were his own children and offered them support and guidance and encouragement. He understood that the relationships you build are the architecture of a meaningful and rich life. And he always made the time, spent the energy, went out of his way to connect with people he loved and who loved and needed him, to let them know he was thinking of them, that he was there. The hole left by my dad's passing will never be filled. We can only hope to try to nourish the seeds that he planted with his life. His non-judgmental, free, and affectionate love, his immense generosity of heart and spirit, the power of showing up for the people you love, his patient listening ear, his constant wonder and gratitude for the gifts of life, his commitment to Jewish life, the primacy of devotion to your family always, in spite of the small differences and squabbles that may arise, his devotion to continual learning and betterment, and his obligation to reach out, give back, and care for all those who need the love. In the end, he was at peace with his illness and his passing. When we went to the final MRI and received the devastating news of the spread of his cancer, he looked at me in the car ride home, seeing my tears, and said, "It's okay. I always knew it would end this way. I had a wonderful life." On the day before he passed, we looked at him and asked him how he was, and he said, "I'm fine. I'm great." He was always great. Whenever you asked him how he was great. Because in spite of the horrible pain and challenge of this past year of suffering and decline, he still always managed to maintain gratitude and optimism and stay anchored in the gifts of life. That gives me some peace, gives all of us peace, and illuminates so much of the beautiful human being he was. My dad was a prince among men. I will miss him every day of my life. I do already, of course. I can only hope to try to live into and up to the examples that he set for me, for all of us, of what it means to build and live a life of love and meaning, to craft a legacy with each of your days. In Judaism, we often say, may his memory be a blessing. My dad's life was an immense blessing, the biggest blessing a child could ask for. May we somehow find the strength and fortitude to magnify those blessings in the days and weeks and months to come.
I was in medical school when I first met Bobby. That he was a pediatrician helped to ground our relationship and served as a gateway into the world of medicine, given that it didn't have family or friends who lived in that world. He provided much needed support and counsel, something he was great at, to me and countless others. During my first 2 years of schooling, I quickly learned the part of medicine that was transmitted through lecture halls and anatomy labs, that of facts, organ systems, and disease processes. As I progressed during my medical school training, I began to understand the part of medicine that was practiced at the patient's bedside. As I transitioned into my third and fourth year, the years that medical students begin clinical rotations and seeing patients, I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Bob in his clinic in Skokie. For 4 weeks, I had a front row seat to witness Bobby in action. At that point, he had been in practice for 30 years. Seeing him interact with his patients was like watching a master craftsman. He clearly understood that medicine was an art and a science. It was there that I began to appreciate how much he cared for the practice of medicine, as well as the close relationships he had with his patients. He used words and phrases such as, "You are doing everything you need to be doing, and don't stop being an amazing mother." Phrases I often find myself using in the same situations in the emergency department. He also used nonverbal gestures as well, such as giving warm embraces to an unsure parent or patient. Doctoring was in his mind the noblest of professions, and because of this, we had a special connection. He would often say to me that as long as you do what is right for the patient, things generally take care of themselves. And he was right. Sir William Osler, a physician in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who was the first to bring medical students out of the lecture hall for bedside clinical training, said, "The good physician treats the disease. The great physician treats the patient who has the disease." Bob was a great physician and a great teacher. He was great for many reasons. Not only was he astute in his clinical knowledge and acumen, that was a given. He was great because he was always genuine. He was a straight shooter and never put on an act. Bob was himself wherever he went, and people, including myself, who knew and interacted with him, felt this in a deep and profound way. He allowed his emotive side to pervade both his professional and personal life. He wore his heart on his sleeve and acted out of a deep sense of connection and care. His openness, kindness, and ability to put people at ease allowed them to reciprocate and open themselves and confide in him. This was the case with me as well. He would often call me his son. I would say thank you, and he would stop, look me square in the face with a deep, piercing glance, and say, "No, I mean that. You are a son to me." He was always there to support. He and Carol were always there to support Rebecca and me, and always present for our children, showing up for the moments of celebration as well as the more difficult ones. To me, he was like a second father, and I already miss him greatly. I hope in the weeks, months, and years to come, we are all able to continue to feel his presence and glean the sustenance and blessing he provided for each of us.
Hi. I don't think Bob would mind if I shared this card that I wrote to him on his last birthday. Dear Bob, I remember after I moved to Chicago, or maybe just before, when I was really able to spend quality time with the family, I quickly noticed how everyone, immediate family, extended family, even friends who are like family, young and old, all turn to you for counsel. People come to you, the patriarch of this family, for political opinions, relationship help, sports commentary, and of course, medical advice. But it struck me as more than simply, you have a medical degree. It truly spoke to who you are. And then I came closer in that orbit when I married Michael and took the Minkus name. I always try to uphold your good name and the glowing reputation you have earned. I want to represent you with the same kindness, professionalism, and generosity that you give. I hold my head high and walk with confidence knowing I am a Minkus. People always ask me, "Oh, are you related to Dr. Minkus?" I love him. You have cultivated more than a fan following with an impressive Rolodex of patients, students, and parents. It is who you are that draws people to you like paper clips to a magnet. And to us, you give so much. Simply put, our family has had a better life because of you. Doors open easier, people smile faster, and befriend me quicker because of you. But more than that, Bob, you have provided us with experiences, perspectives, and unconditional love that make our lives better. In small and big ways, we have a better life because of who you are. It's your birthday, but we are the ones who have the gift of being your children. Love, Laura.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Shadler, and I am Hannah's husband. Bob's children have spoken today and shared what it was like to have him as a father, and I hope that in my own small way, I can add something to what has been said here today and give you a sense of what it was like to have Bob as a father-in-law. The first time that I had the opportunity to spend an extended amount of time with Bob, and really the whole Minkus family, was when we went on a trip to Hilton Head in the spring of 2006. Hannah and I had been dating for a year. Hannah was living in Chicago, and I was in Boston, and I flew down to meet her family for the week. I was full of trepidation as I had not spent much time with Bob or his family and was nervous about what to expect. This was a big step in our relationship, and I am nothing if not cautious and deliberate. My entrance onto the family scene immediately gave me a taste of Bob's legendary hyper-detailed trip planning. While much of the trip was just a relaxed beach vacation, he did plan a full day in Charleston for us. The day started with a crack of dawn wake-up call so we could catch a ferry to Fort Sumner and hear a series of guided ranger talks about the history of the site. During those talks, Bob was repeatedly scolded by the ranger for sitting on the walls of the fort. In character, he ignored the ranger and continued to sit on the walls. Following that, it was back to Charleston for another hours-long historical walking tour of the city in the suffocating heat and humidity of late May in South Carolina. The day ended with us all changing into formal clothes in a parking lot so he could take us to dinner at the Peninsula Grill, where he loved the coconut cake. I may not remember every historical fact about Charleston that we learned that day, but what I remember very clearly is that during the day we talked about William Manchester's biography of Winston Churchill, which I was reading at the time. I vividly remember discussing different parts of the book with Bob and his genuine interest in my thoughts. A number of years later, when the last book in the series was finally published, he recalled our discussion too, and he bought me a copy. By the end of the trip, it was totally apparent to me that I need not have worried. What I encountered from Bob, and have continued to experience to this day, is a warm and easy love that has fully embraced and accepted me, not only as Hannah's husband or as the father of his grandchildren, but also a love for me as an individual. They say that women often marry their fathers, but that was decidedly not the case for Hannah. Bob and I are very different people. Bob was a larger-than-life extrovert, and I'm very much an introvert. Where Bob was outspoken and always willing to share his opinion, I am quite reserved. Bob exuded confidence and was certain in everything he did. In contrast, "It depends" is one of my favorite phrases, something Hannah often, perhaps always, finds maddening. Since I first really got to know Bob on that trip to Hilton Head, much has changed in our lives. Hannah and I have gotten married and finished graduate school, moved to New York and then back, bought a house in Skokie, and most significantly, of course, had 3 children. In truth, I've grown from a child into adult during that time, all under the watchful care and love of Bob. I believe that it often does depend, that things are very complicated, and that the world consists of shades of gray. But during these years, one thing was never in doubt. One thing did not depend, and that was that Bob loved me and always treated me like his own child. I've worked hard to deserve that love and affection, to be a better husband and father, a better person, and I have learned so much from him. His generosity, his affection, his guidance. I was not always ready or able to accept it, but I always knew he was there for me and was willing to freely share his love. I'm profoundly grateful to Bob and Carol for accepting me into their family and loving me like a son. I love you both.
I assume most of you have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, it's a pretty famous movie. Or as my grandpa would describe, the best movie ever created. For those of you that haven't, it's a story about a man who, when everything is going wrong in his life, wishes that he had never been born. So an angel gives him the real chance to see what life would be like for his loved ones if he had truly never been born. He ends up realizing the immense impact that he had had on those close to him, as well as many people around the town. My grandpa took me to see this movie several years ago for the first time before COVID at the Music Box Theater. During the whole movie, I sat there, pretty unimpressed, taking in scene after scene. I wondered why he wanted me to see this movie so badly. And then it got to the end of the movie. And sorry for the spoilers, but when George Bailey arrives back at his house, the entire town shows up to save him from his debts by paying him back for the many acts of kindness he had done for them over the course of his life. At that moment, I couldn't help myself. I just broke down and cried. I felt pretty embarrassed for a second, crying there in a movie theater full of strangers. And then I looked over at my grandfather, and he was crying just as much as I was, if not more. It was the kind of crying that was so exaggerated it looked like it was fake. I seriously thought he was going to die. I remember him saying to me, "We'll watch this movie together every year, and every year we'll cry together at the ending." He had watched this movie countless times, and had never failed to cry unstoppably at the ending. My grandfather and I were so alike in so many ways. Both very emotional people, both perfectionists and overachievers, both people who wanted to get the job done the right way. I'm only like that because of him. He used to tell me, Everything worth doing is worth doing right. That was his father's mantra, and it became mine as well, as I internalized it and called it to mind whenever I was confronted with a difficult task. My grandfather taught me how to drive, making sure that I would never forget the importance of being a defensive driver, saying it over and over and over again. He taught me the ins and outs of the stock market and how to invest your money properly, as he believed this was the most important way to invest your money. Why pass up a chance to make money by doing absolutely nothing? He would tell me. He made sure I had a cultural education, taking me to plays, symphonies, and operas. He also made sure I had a historical education, never passing up the chance to lecture me on the facts of different wars, as well as the history of any place that I was traveling to. I remember he made my family and I watch a 4 or 5 part documentary series detailing the complete history of England before my family's trip to London several years ago, just to make sure that we had the context necessary to fully appreciate our experience. He taught me how to play golf, a sport I had previously thought was incredibly boring. Turned out not to be so bad after months of practice, but I was extremely frustrated at the start. My grandfather was patiently there every step of the way, guiding me. Above all, my grandpa taught me to be a kind, giving, and loving person. He imparted this lesson to every single one of his grandchildren, making sure that we knew to show up for the people that we cared about and look out for those who are in need. I will never forget the trip to India that we took together, just us, when I was in 7th grade. Although I was still very young, I was able to understand the importance of helping others, the very reason why he took me on this trip. I will always treasure the time that we were able to spend together, just the two of us. One thing that I always took for granted was my Jewish community. I've gone to Jewish school my entire life, gone to a Jewish summer camp, and been surrounded by Jewish friends. That is entirely because of him. I had the opportunity early last year to speak to him for hours on end about our family's history. I was making a short film to document it. He prided himself on being the holder of our family's story. He collected hundreds of family documents, photos, and has traveled to museums in Iron River in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in which our family's name is enshrined. During those talks, above all, he stressed his dedication to Judaism. He told me that his parents practiced very little Judaism, even less than their parents before them and their parents before them. He had made a conscious decision at some point in his life that he wanted to live life as a dedicated Jew. So he elected to send his kids to Jewish day school and raise them in a Jewish environment. If he had not made this change, my life and the lives of many of our family members would have been extremely different. I cannot stress how important my Jewish identity has been to my life, and I wish I could still express my gratitude to him for doing that. One thing that constantly confounded me about my grandfather was his attitude. He lived life with no regrets. Whenever I asked him how he was, he would always answer without fail, "I'm great, I'm fine." I was always waiting for the day that I would ask him how he was, and he would say that he wasn't so great, because that would be the day that things were really bad. But it never came. Even on Saturday, the day before he died, when I came to see him for the last time, and I asked him how he was, he told me, "I'm just fine, I'm doing great." If I had as much time as I wanted to speak about my grandfather, we would probably be here until 2022. But I'm on a time constraint, so I'll leave you with this. I always wondered why It's a Wonderful Life was my grandfather's favorite movie. I mean, it was made in 1947. He was a year old when this movie came out. It's one of those black and white movies that people always say are classics, but are impossible for the kids of my generation to fully appreciate. But right now, looking out on all of you, and seeing how many people he touched and impacted throughout his life in so many ways, I don't wonder that anymore. Because no man is a failure who has friends. Thank you.
As Rebecca shared, Sukkot was one of Bob's favorite holidays. The building of his sukkah and the inviting of guests, Time to celebrate and relish the blessings of this world. There's a debate in our tradition about what we actually commemorate on Sukkot. God caused us to dwell in Sukkot in the desert, but what were the Sukkot? Rabbi Akiva says that they were physical, literal homes that we dwelt in, physical buildings. We were vulnerable. We had just been birthed from Egypt. We were in the desert and we needed protection, and God gave us physical protection. But there's a second opinion that the Sukkot were Ananei HaKavod, says Rabbi Eliezer. They were the clouds of glory. They weren't physical at all. It was spiritual cover. And on Sukkot, we celebrate the dual aspect, that the sukkah protects us physically, but it also protects us spiritually. And thinking about Bob's legacy, thinking about the safety and the care, the physical protection he afforded to so many of us, that he guided new life into this world when it was vulnerable. He met patients in their vulnerability. He met parents in their vulnerability and offered the physical protection of his knowledge, his availability, his follow-through. But as much as his work was about physical bodies, as has been said, it was really about the neshama. It was about the spirit and the soul. It was about compassion and connection and spiritual protection of the Ananei HaKavod. And in the sukkah, the meeting between that physical and spiritual realm is the schach. Dr. Minkus was our schach, providing physical protection when needed, providing spiritual protection when needed, always with that light and humble touch of the schach. The first time the verb, the sachech, to cover, appears in the Torah, it's not in reference to a sukkah, it's actually reference to the kruvim, to two heavenly figures that rested over the ark. And it says, V'hayu akruvim porshei knafayim lamala. The kruvim stretched their arms out, stretched their wings out upward. Sochachim b'chanfeihem. They covered, they protected with their wings. Al haparochet, over the ark, upnehem ish el achiv, and they faced one another. The Talmud in Chagiga says that the kruvim were two faces, one of a man and the other of a child, facing one another. A man and a child facing one another, protecting. I had my experiences of that facing and that protection, sitting in my parents' lap under Dr. Minkus' care, face to face, not behind a screen, not behind a white coat with a little koala bear. Face to face with love and compassion. And I experienced that care again 30 years later, this past July, in Dr. Minkus' office, as a parent with my child sitting in my lap, face to face. And I would be remiss if on behalf of everyone here and everyone, I'm sure there are hundreds watching on Zoom, I want to thank Carol and all of you on behalf of all who were under his care for sharing him with us, this giant of a man who was so available, and I know that came at costs at times. And all of us are so indebted to all of you for making him available for us in that way. In that last visit that I was there with Bob in his office in July with my Ellie, it was clear that something was wrong. It was clear that he was very vulnerable. And I knew in that visit, I didn't know exactly what was wrong, but I knew that there might not be any more visits. And yet, even when he was so vulnerable and so frail, I still felt protected by him. And it's so amazing to know that I was one of the thousands of children and parents and caregivers and family and friends and students who felt that same feeling of protection under his wings. You shared the story about how even in his final days, he was protecting, he was caring as you were weeping, and he said, "It's okay. I had a wonderful life. It's such a beautiful day today." Bob's physical sukkah has come down, and it's a tremendous loss for all of you, and for all of us, and for so many hundreds, if not thousands. But the spiritual protection, the Ananei HaKavod that stretches over us, the reassurance he gave us, the teachings, the models, the love, the compassion. That schach does not come down. It's always up there, stretching out over each and every one of us who came under his care. May we draw strength from his memory and his teachings and his love, and may his memory always be for us as a blessing. As it is Chol Hamoed, we don't recite the formal Kel Maleh prayer, but we'll recite a verse of Tehillim, a verse of Psalms, with the kavanah, with the intention that it's an ascent for his soul, Ruvain ben Miriam ben Moshe. You can rise if you wish. Shir Lamalot, Esa Einai al Ha'arim, Me'ayin Yavo Ezri Me'im Adonai, Oseh Shamayim Ba'aretz, Al Yiten Lamot Raglecha, Al Yanum Shomrecha, Adonai Tzilcha Al Yad Yeminecha, Hine Lo Yanum Velo Yishan, Shomer Yisrael, Yomam Hashemesh Lo Yakeka, Ve'areach Balayla, Adonai Yishmorcha Mikol Ra, Yishmor et Nafshecha, Adonai Yishmor et Eincha Voecha, Me'ata Ve'ad Olam. May God guard the goings of the soul of Ruvain ben Moshe and Miriam, now and forevermore. This concludes the funeral service for today. We'll transition now to the burial.
The interment will take place at West Lawn Cemetery, and our procession will form in our parking lot. For those of you going to the cemetery, we'll be providing those vehicles with an orange funeral sticker, which will be placed on the inside portion of your front windshield, and also as an added measure of safety, a magnetic flag will be placing on top of your vehicle. And please keep in mind to use your bright headlights and your emergency flasher lights at all times while in procession. For those of you serving as pallbearers at the cemetery, please come directly to the hearse once we arrive. The Shiva will begin, due to the holiday, the Shiva will be beginning a week from today, Thursday, September 30th. And please see the service folder for all the various locations and times of the Shiva. For those of you viewing online, that information is on our website as well. Memorial contributions will be going to the Camp Ramah, or Solomon Schechter Day School, or Rochelle Zell Jewish High School, and that information is also in the folder and also on our website. At this time, I'll ask everyone to please rise as the family is escorted from the chapel. I'll ask for those of you going to the cemetery to please go directly to your vehicles, and also you can exit through the front door here as well as the rear doors. Thank you.